Putin's number two, Dmitry Medvedev, said that, quote, "To all who are waiting for retribution, you need not worry. This is a normal person's quality. Retribution is inevitable." Now that we've had several attacks now on Russia, on Russian territory, the latest being Crimea, the airfields has been the most dramatic and the most controversial. Talk about what the response could be and what do you find is the significance of all of this as we move into possibly a dangerous phase of this conflict?
Well, Danny, of course, I don't know what the ultimate significance is going to be, but I can speculate, and I can speculate fairly powerfully, I think. First, I'd like to back up and say, if it's true, the public reports that this planning has been going on for 18 months, then there is absolutely no doubt, there was no doubt in my mind in the first place, that NATO, read Washington, Britain, France, Germany, the whole complex, was involved with this, but principally the United States, because it's got the assets to do the kinds of things that were done, basically intelligence and satellites. But the second thing I wanted to say about it, and I said yesterday on another podcast, is that just imagine for a moment that someone proximate to the United States, or maybe in a submarine or something like that, proximate to the United States, launched an attack that struck Barstow in Louisiana or Minot and blew up B-52s, or hit Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and blew up B-2s. Imagine what we would do if that occurred, because at least some of us are still steeped in the what I call the doctrine of the Cold War, where we never did these sorts of things. But hitting someone's nuclear strike power, and I think if I remember right about the START treaty, which is still active until February of 26, however moribund it might be, one of the requirements was to keep your bombers like that, B-52s, B-2s, and Russian equivalents, in the open. So that was something that was known, and it was that way for a purpose, not so someone could attack them, quite the opposite. And yet we did. And we were planning this for 18 months, if the public information is correct. This is a staggering strategic error, in my view. And Putin would be absolutely justified. I hope he doesn't. I hope he's more prudent than that in coming back with an absolutely resounding attack, which actually could include a nuclear weapon. I don't think it will. I hope and pray that it won't. But that's how stupid this was. And I'm going to watch this unfold with some trepidation, no question about it.
The reports are from CNN that Pete Hegseth was getting intelligence on this. And so your response to how Russia is reacting to this, as well as the U.S.'s role and what this reflects about this conflict.
Well, thanks, Danny. I mean, for starters, I expect Russia's response to be very measured and reciprocal in a certain way in terms of the damage that it incurred, what it's going to inflict on Ukraine. Russia's well aware that the West's strategy is basically predicated on a NATO Article 5 tripwire. And so they're obviously going to be very careful about overreacting because they know this is part of the West's strategy. And but at some point, Russia could reserve, not now, but down the road, to call this bluff, basically, because now you're getting into very dicey territory. And if you remember, just 12 months ago, around the same time as this week, last May in 2024, Ukraine launched attacks on Russia's long-range nuclear early warning radar system in Orsk, just on the, I think, the western border of Kazakhstan, that area, about 1,500 kilometers, I believe, from Ukraine. So that was deep into Russian territory. And that was kind of an interesting kind of attack because it's right before this Switzerland peace summit that Zelensky had staged. Obviously, there's going to be nothing happening there when something like that precedes the scheduled negotiations. Same exact situation here. This basically kills any chance of goodwill at the Istanbul summit. So, but yet Russia proceeds by the book, as you'd expect, and they've laid out their demands, obviously political first, then technical talks of ceasefire and things like that. And that's the way it should be. And that's what's missing, I think, from the U.S. dialogue, is there's no willingness by the United States to address the overarching political concerns. And then that's also part of the national security concerns of Russia. And until that's done, everything else is secondary, and it's not going to, you're not even going to make it to second base until you deal with those things, which are very similar to what the United States presented the last administration and the last Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and the State Department during December of, I believe, 2021. And then after that, subsequently, more or less the same by Russia. So it's not as if there's any surprises here from that side. What we do have, though, is lots of surprises from the United States side, from the Ukrainian side, and also from the NATO side. A lot of moving of the goalposts, a lot of flip-flopping, and then a continuation of these provocations, which are hugely counterproductive. And I think they're designed to be counterproductive, because my personal opinion is, and if the U.S. backs off, and we can talk more about the political dimension of this, the U.S. can't just say, oh, we're going to back off and wipe our hands of this if, the Europeans or the Ukrainians or the Russians and Ukrainians don't get along or whatever. We're just going to, as J.D. Vance says, we're going to pull away from it. I think that's a massive mistake. I think it's a cop-out. I think it shows the United States is weak. And is no longer considered to be a responsible world power. They have to be involved. They need to broker a deal with Russia first, and then those demands need to be impressed upon Ukraine. This is the only way that we're going to avoid potential World War III here.
Patrick said that the first deal has to be between the United States and Russia. There is a deal. There is an understanding. They both see merit in tamping down this thing and finally ending it. That's the big backdrop here of all this discussion. Now, the analogy between what would happen if they did it to us, it's valid, but it only goes so far, because we have our leader as a kind of overcharged, emotionally unpredictable leader who probably would lash out. It's not the same on the other side. Putin is cool hand Luke. I mean, hello. This is all to provoke him into what the British say is a wrong footing Putin. In other words, they do this, the timing I mean now, they do this right before the negotiations, the second round, begin in Istanbul. And I dare say they were hoping that Putin would be overly charged emotionally, like people in the West, and say, well, I don't want negotiations. That's it. We're going to send arithmetics. And that way the U.S. would be kind of blackmailed into, well, caving in or supporting these idiot Europeans that think they can win against a much stronger Russia. One of the saving graces I saw here was that there are the negotiations. That's a biggie. And there are high-level contacts between American and Russian officials. Now, what happened? Well, I saw in the New York Times that it was at the Russian initiative that Lavrov and Rubio talked about this, okay? And Lavrov, in other words, caused the telephone call. That's new. Now, what we know about that readout, so far as I can see, is that Rubio already knew about the sabotage of those two bridges. And he said, my condolences, so to speak. I don't think that's right. I really expressed my sympathy on that. Whether, I haven't looked at the timing yet, whether Rubio already knew about these deep penetration strikes by drones into Russia, well, maybe he did, but I don't think he was ready to respond to that. The readout, such as we have, doesn't indicate he said anything about that. So I'm sure Lavrov braced him on that. But the idea is that Rubio and Lavrov were talking, whether, as I suggested in a tweet, that actually Trump and Putin needed to talk before Putin started to become emotionally overcharged. Okay. Anyhow, what happened at the foreign minister level did happen. And I think that the negotiations actually have been successful to the point where they've started out with little baby steps. Well, 6,000 frozen Ukrainian corpses taken out of deep freeze and given back to Ukraine for decent burial. These things may not seem much to us, but I think they mean a lot to the Ukrainians. They are goodwill gestures, and these are minor compared with the major concessions that will be necessary, given that the Russians are winning and not going to settle for much less. Given the negotiations going on, given the high level of contacts, I take some solace in the notion that although there are hotheads that want this thing to go out of control, cool hand Luke in Moscow is going to prevent that by not being provoked.
All of the Western mainstream media reports are saying that this was about leverage on Russia. And we've heard this over and over and over again, that these terror attacks, whether it's Crimea, whether it's these drone attacks, that it's all about getting Russia to the table and essentially capitulating. But how might this actually backfire on Ukraine?
Well, let me say I don't share Ray's sanguine opinion about this at all. Let me say that I suspect this is going to go on and on and on and on. And what I'm hearing from Istanbul is that that is a prospect of it going on and on and on, because they're not even close. And Ukraine is not going to come around to the adamant position that the Russians have. And saying that the United States, in its current state of disarray, and I do mean that, disarray, is going to be a mediator of consequence in this, even though the situation might demand that, and I think that's true, it does, is nonsense. There's no way this president vacillating from one pole to the other, with a cabinet that clearly doesn't know where he's going from one day to the next, with an intelligence community that apparently doesn't even respond to his wishes, and an intelligence community that apparently doesn't speak to anyone but J.D. Vance. And one has to wonder if J.D. Vance is the right conduit for giving Trump, or even if Trump allows him to give him a recent, decent picture of what's happening in various places, including Gaza and the Middle East in general, and including Russia and Ukraine. So I'm not at all happy or hopeful about this situation. I could see this going on and Russia tolerating it's going on because it can't do anything else but let it go on and continue to win for months. And the disarray of the empires were continuing as it is now, and maybe even deepening and becoming more profound. And let me add the disarray of the EU and the disarray of NATO too. We have so many leaders in NATO now, even in crucial countries like Germany and France, and I would say England too, that aren't supported by their people. They do not have a majority of their people who are in their coalition, as it were, or supporting them. So they're short-termers in many respects. And figuring out where the EU is going and where NATO is going is not very difficult, down the tubes. And if I were to say as a military professional what Putin's real objectives were, say 15 years ago, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, I'd place them in three categories. One, to destroy the transatlantic link. Two, to get rid of NATO. And three, to keep his reasonably sound energy hegemony over Western Europe. Maybe the third one being unaccomplishable, but nonetheless maybe a product of the first two. He's going right down that list, and he's being successful, but he's not being successful because of his strategic skills so much as because our lack thereof and because our mistakes. That's why he's winning. And that's the thing that bothers me, the bigger picture that's occurring right now.
The reaction to this, on one hand, speculative, but on the other, there are many who have been clamoring that Putin do more, that he's not doing enough in response to all of this. I'm guessing, what's your take, given what you've heard both Ray and Colonel Wilkerson outline here?
I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic. Always optimistic. You can't be engaged in any diplomacy unless you're optimistic. You have to be an optimist at heart. So on that side, I share Ray's sentiments that regardless of how bad this looks like in terms of a geopolitical, diplomatic, foreign policy train wreck, they're talking to each other, and we have to hope that that's overall a positive thing. And they're talking to each other. The Americans and the Russians have a line of communication. The Washington and the Iranians, Washington and Hamas, but specifically on the Russia-Ukraine situation. This is perhaps the most volatile now this week. So by that token, I share Larry Wilkinson's concern just about the overarching, what I think is a huge mistake that's being made by the Trump administration. I think part of it's incompetence, but a lot of it is just a lack of understanding and a lack of appreciation, because I'll be generous that Donald Trump has the right ideas. He has the right intentions. He wants peace. But I don't believe that he has the personnel to pull off the type of high wire act, multiple plate spinning, 3 different major geopolitical flashpoints. I don't think he has the people who have the skill set, nor do they have the subject area experts to pull off any of these negotiations. Hence, they're all fumbling. If you look at Russia-Ukraine, it's materially worse right now. Diplomatically, potential for, they just hit the Russia's nuclear long-range deterrent. I mean, this is bad. We're at DEFCON. We're going up the scale towards DEFCON 1, and in Gaza, it's materially worse since Trump came into office. And then Iran, we have threats of attacking Iran preemptively that are still getting purchase in Israel and in Washington. So this isn't good. So they're potentially fumbling all 3 major negotiations. I can't think of a bigger disaster. And it's not as if there aren't competent, skilled people available in the Beltway that can help to advise, including our present company on this panel, Colonel Wilkerson and Ray McGovern, who are subject area experts, and they're one or two of many who could fill that role, and they're not doing it. Instead, he's pared down his team. He doesn't have the type of complement. He's sending a private envoy, which I think is completely unprofessional and unrealistic, that Steve Witkoff himself is going to garner any results. Marco Rubio is not really involved in the way that previous Secretary of States are involved. So this hierarchical system that Trump has constructed, I think, is a disaster. Not only that, I think the rhetoric that this is not my war, this is Biden's war, that works politically for a while. But you can't just pretend to be aloof and say, and at the same say this would never have happened if I was president, and then this week saying I wasn't in the loop, I didn't know about the assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin, and I didn't know about this drone strike. You can't. It did happen under your watch, Donald Trump. You are president, and the war is happening. So that old shtick is just completely getting old. And then this backing off, if they can't make a deal, we're just going to wash our hands of this. The U.S. is shirking its duty as a nuclear power, as a UN Security Council member. They have they're duty bound. They have an obligation to the international community to play that role, responsible role, to tamp down tensions. That's been traditionally the role of previous administrations. Instead, they're really careening in the opposite direction. And this is a problem. Is it because this administration doesn't appreciate what's at stake? Do they not appreciate previous administrations and the types of people who played those roles before and what could be learned from them? You have to remember, even Ronald Reagan could call Richard Nixon for counsel if he needed. And I'm sure Ray has plenty of stories from his career where previous administrations were called in to give opinions and direction and counsel and help. I don't see them drawing from that type of intelligence pool in this administration, and that frightens me. I see the opposite happening. I see them basically burying their head, closing ranks, and taking this kind of tortoise position half the time with the media, and it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence, quite frankly.
That we have 2 area subject experts and / diplomats right on this program with you and me, Danny. These are the kinds of people that should be available for counsel and advice. Now, we're doing our best by talking to folks like you, Danny, but we're not getting much headway, at least not yet. Now, there's no denying the fact that there's chaos and that Trump is unpredictable and that he's bitten off a lot more than he can chew. He's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for God's sake. On Gaza, it is unconscionable that we would continue to support, to enable genocide. So let's, if we can, at least intellectually, put Gaza and China and the rest of the Middle East actually at one side and say, okay, what about Ukraine? On Ukraine, for whatever reason, his instincts are good, as Patrick suggested, and so are Putin's. Putin's instincts are, well, wow, this is a window of opportunity. This fellow Trump really seems to want to do some kind of deal. I've explained to him how hard it's going to be, and he wants to do it anyway, okay? Witkoff, in that respect, has played a useful role. So there's chaos. I've never seen the government in such disarray, but to the degree that Trump is in control, and that's an essential question, he and Witkoff can bring this off. Now, with respect, I made another, one thing that Larry suggested about if we, the United States, tried to be a mediator of consequence. I don't see that as our role, and more important, of course, I don't think that that Trump sees that as our role. His role was to get the Russians and the Ukrainians together, and he and Putin worked out just 3 weeks ago very clever ways to doing precisely that, and now the Russians and the Ukrainians have talked twice. Now, well, let's go on and on and on. Yeah, but that's a good thing. It's better to jaw than war, as Winston Churchill says. Now, that's an imperfect analogy because there is war while jaw is going on. But what's the war about? The war is about Russia, how much it's going to win and how much it might be prepared for some kind of compromises to get its core interests, as it says, honored and agreed to. So this is going to take a long time, and it may never come to fruition, these negotiations. But meanwhile, Russia is taking over as much of Ukraine as it thinks it needs to have this buffer zone, so-called by Putin, so that in the final analysis, the Ukrainians, what's left of Ukraine, can't do damage to Russia. Now, with these drones and stuff like that's going to be a very artful inspection regime or treaty or whatever it is. But, we used to, just to finish up, we used to use this word, недоговороспособный. Договор is agreement. Sposobny is able to, okay? So you're not able to make an agreement. That was what the Russians were calling the U.S., and that's what the U.S. was calling the Russians, okay? But now, wow, they're getting together. That is, the Ukrainians and the Russians are getting together, and the Ukrainians seem to be договороспособность all of a sudden, and the Russians are willing to make concessions. I'm pretty sure they are. They don't want to be burdened with a whole Ukraine under their tutelage. They don't want another Vietnam for themselves. So there's room there. It's just that, what was the word? On and on and on and on. Well, I see that as a good thing because I see it as a safety valve to have some prospect that there could be progress in a more peaceful way rather than slugging it out with Oreshniks and other things in Ukraine.